Well, you have to go back to the beginning. And recently I wrote a book called This Way to the Revolution. It's the story of the setting up of the first shelter in the world and then what happened subsequently. Now, for the first few years, I built a therapeutic community because I realized that where a parent can't parent because they too have been brought up in violence, there needs to be a therapeutic intervention. When you have a child that's come in, as an example, his father was a murderer. He murdered another child when he was 13. He strangled the child. And everybody was terrified of Peter except for me. And I talked to Peter. He'd been let out of prison. He'd been in prison since he was little. But when you know that his mother was a prostitute and beat him, she then abandoned him, and his father sodomized him regularly, which is why at 13 he was in the children's home. Who do we put in the dock? Where does it stop? That generational violence has probably gone on for 4 or 5 generations. I've always said what we need is family therapy. And indeed, I changed the name from Women's Aid to Family Rescue. And this is what we haven't done. A few years later, the emerging feminist movement, it was called liberation, women's liberation in those days, where they had a meeting in Washington after they'd all come back from fighting in the South against segregation. And the women there decided to turn on the men in their lives, the left-wing men. They said, we will no longer fight global capitalism. We will now rename this the patriarchy. This is how this was born. And with that meant that they had access to all women everywhere. Men were the enemy. And all of a sudden, those of us who were following desperately this idea of a new movement, which we understood was equality for women, was actually a sham. And that we were all paying our money into joining the women's liberation movement. Then we were told to have groups in our houses. And then we were told that we would have consciousness-raising sessions. Now, I know exactly where we're going because my father and mother were captured in Tin Sin in 1949 under a house arrest by the communists. So my father was an expert on how it worked. And it was interesting because, as far as I was concerned, when the first meeting in my house, called the Goldhawk Road Group, this head honcho came down and told me that my isolation with children and the wish to do something to join with other women was not my problem. My problem was my husband. He was my oppressor. And I remember laughing and saying, well, I'm living enormously comfortably. He's paying the mortgage, so I have the luxury to stay at home. She said, well, yes, but what you don't realize is that you have a mink-lined cage. And I looked at it and I thought, I just thought, I was there in the very early days. And I knew quite a lot of the people who were the leading lights in this. I would say the majority of them. That's that mantra that we were given. The personal is the political. If your father is a bastard and is violent, then all men are bastards and violent. That's really what went behind it. And they used to pick at me regularly when I spoke anywhere. And the banners would actually say, all men are rapists, all men are bastards. And I had to have a police escort for a book I wrote called Prone to Violence, which is a study of my therapeutic program. But in 1974, there was a small conference given by us to help other groups. But unbeknown to us, they had all been organizing, and a lot of them were American, and they voted themselves into a national organization that would be feminist, and that men would not be able to work in any of the refuges, and boys over the age of 9 to 12 would not be admitted. And that's the situation now, 43 years later.